The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, and ended on July 27, 1953. The war was between North and South Korea and was a battle between capitalism and communism. The North wanted to spread communism to the South and make the South a part of North Korea. North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea with 75,000 soldiers. At the end of the Korean War, 5 million people died. Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea at the time, went to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to try to convince him to help North Korea invade South Korea. Joseph Stalin did not want to help him at first because he was worried about U.S. involvement. Joseph wanted to train his men and prepare North Korea's men and supply them first, before they invade. Eventually, on June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. On June 27, 1950, 2 days after the invasion, the U.S. got involved and President Truman sent American troops to South Korea to help South Korea against the North. The North Korean soldiers were well-disciplined, well-trained, and well-supplied. South Korea was scared and confused and wanted to run away from the battlefield. North Korea also invaded at the hottest time. American and South Korean soldiers were dying of thirst. The soldiers had to drink water from the rice paddies which had been fertilized with human waste. Drinking from that also leads to diseases and illnesses. Military medical services had been held back after World War II. When the war began in Korea, there was a shortage of physicians until the Doctor Draft Law passed in September 1950. The physicians worked in new mobile army surgical hospitals in the field. Happiness in Korea was often low also. The extreme cold was depressing and the lack of adequate clothing, modern weapons, or hot foods, and the conditions in the trenches made life almost unbearable. Unlike in earlier conflicts, soldiers' mail in Korea was censored. Their letters provide a unique record of just how hard life was in Korea. One of the biggest fears during the war was being captured by the enemy. The communists did not follow the Geneva Conventions that laid down rules on the treatment of prisoners of war, also known as POWs. The North Koreans killed many POWs. Other prisoners spent brutal winters in prison camps with insufficient food, clothing, or shelter. Many did not survive. Air power gave the United Nations command hope to beat the Chinese manpower and increasing firepower. The chief of Far East Air Force won the battle for air superiority, having fewer than 100 F-86s against the Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean MiG-15s. Pilots from all the U.S. Armed Forces destroyed at least 500 MiGs at a loss of 78 F-86s. The Soviets rotated their squadrons of their air defense, losing more than 200 pilots. Bombing was the first limited to attacks on North Korean cities.
One of the biggest battles in the Korean War was the Battle of Bloody Ridge. The Battle of Bloody Ridge was an engagement of the Korean War fought between August 18th and September 5th of 1951. Bloody Ridge was part of a system of outposts constructed on top of the Tibet mountain range north of the 38th parallel border that divided both Koreas and gave the Chinese forces occupying them an excellent operation post from where to call artillery strikes against positions. The United Nations attack at Bloody Ridge was part of a series of operations intended to secure their defenses by depriving the Chinese of observation points overlooking the United Nations' main line of resistance. The forces defending the Bloody Ridge were some 15,000 North Korean and Chinese soldiers who were well protected around the hill and had time to set up a complicated system of defenses. The task of capturing the hill fell on the United States 2nd Infantry Division, which was commanded by General N. Ruffner, who also counted on Filipinos and the South Korean 36th Regiment as reinforcements. Ruffner could also call air support to help him destroy the Chinese bunkers on top of the hill. The Chinese had built deep bunkers inside of the hill that were capable of resisting American bombardment. They set up a network of minefield. The United Nations used air and artillery attacks to soften up the enemy's defenses, but they had little effect against the Chinese bunker, which protected them from anything except Americans' 155mm guns. The United States also used tanks to spearhead their attacks. The battle commenced with the South Korean 36th Regiment capturing most of the hill after a week of continuous fighting, but losing the gains to a determined North Korean counterattack. The 9th Infantry Regiment made the next attack against the hill, and after 10 days of fighting back and forth, they were able to capture one of its objectives. The 2nd Division continued attacking with its other regiments until the Communists retreated in defeat on September 5th after suffering their entire number of casualties and wounded. United Nations combined forces and reported suffering 2,700 casualties during the attack, with around 8,000 of their own men killed with more than 7,000 more wounded. The communists saw virtually each and every one of their servicemen involved in the battle a casualty. Bloody Ridge marked the start of a new phase of the Korean War. Behind were the great mobile campaigns at the end of the war. Many soldiers were left scared and emotionally exhausted, while their fellow soldiers and friends dying right behind them and having to leave their own loved ones behind. The peace talks finally let U.S. soldiers go home in July 1953. They found a very difficult welcome from the celebrations that had greeted World War II veterans. To the public, the Korean War is a disappointment that had not ended in a U.S. victory. Korean veterans found their experiences were often ignored. After the war in Korea, already poor prior to the war, neither country had very promising prospects for the future. However, in the first 8 years after the conflict, North Korea carried out an impressive recovery under a highly organized, purposeful government that appeared to be laying the foundation for a modern industrial society. By contrast, South Korea during this time was characterized by political corruption and turmoil, sluggish economic growth, dependency on massive aid from the United States. On the surface, at least, there seemed little to suggest that South Korea in 1961 was on the eve of one of the most dramatic economic transformations in history.
There were many effects of the Korean War. The impact it had on the people and history was significant and not to be looked over. Some people call the Korean War the Forgotten War, when the war actually had a big impact on the people of Korea, Americans, and others. Soldiers had PTSD from the war, and civilians were traumatized and scared. When the war ended, the Koreas remained divided. The war was disastrous for all Korea, destroying most of its industries. North Korea fell into poverty and could not keep up with South Korea's economic pace. The Korean War was among the world's most destructive wars in proportion to the population. During the war, population of South Korea declined by nearly 2 million, excluding an influx of nearly 650,000 North Korean refugees. During the same exact period, about 290,000 South Korean migrated to North Korea, either by force or by choice. Redistribution of the South Korean population continued on a large scale, even into the immediate post-war years. Those effects were being long-term and short-term that will never be forgotten. Along the effects of the war had on people, it also had many effects of agriculture and metropolitan areas. The effects on the landscape and building was not to be overlooked. The war destroyed many buildings and ruined many lives and living spaces. Many of the agriculture areas were also destroyed by the war phase. The war phase and destruction of the land didn't allow many people to have source of income by living space. The Korean War was also a crucial turning point in the Cold War, as it was also a battle between communism and capitalism. The Battle of Bloody Ridges has been a fierce and inhumane struggle, in which even many of the survivors would suffer the physiological effects of the war for decades. The American and Korean side suffered almost 3,000 casualties. The Korean War and Chinese side, however, suffered a hardly imaginable 15,000. This all happened on August 18 through September 1951. To sum up everything that has been stated so far, the Korean War was also overlooked and not cared about. But in reality, it was really as important as all the other wars were. The Korean War was destructive, emotional, and many other horrible things. The Korean War should never be forgotten. We should keep in mind all of the American soldiers that died to keep all others and us safe. Nevertheless, the overlooked conflict has exerted a powerful influence that's still felt today. According to Rhodes, the war changed the course of United States of America foreign and national security policy, compelling the United States of America to accept a permanent and military involvement around the globe. Even in peacetime, the Korean War will never be forgotten.